Welcome to the Mysteries Abound podcast, everyone. This is your host, Paul, and this is episode 91. The show this week is entitled A Collection of Scary Bat-Eating spiders. Just for those of you who love arachnids, or those of you who don't. But first up, a trip to one of those places in the world that I really like, Wales. And from the www.walesonline.co.uk website, aliens are targeting Welsh people, claims abduction victim. And this is written by Anthony Stone. Telepathic aliens are targeting Wales in a bid to harvest our superior genetic material. That's according to abduction victim Hilary Porter. While Hilary's stories may sound outlandish or unbelievable, she dismisses those who scoff for being closed-minded. The 67-year-old sought-after speaker and ufologist is claiming a stretch of road between Swansea and Cardiff is a hotspot of alien activity. Hilary says she was so traumatised by her abduction that she was too scared to return to Wales for 4 decades. When she did finally return in 2009 to visit a friend in Llanelli, she drove through the danger area unharmed, only to be abducted from her bed within a day of arrival. Hilary says she has been abducted so many times she has lost count and is convinced that aliens are already among us and only a government cover-up continues to keep it a secret. They know what is going on, but they are absolutely powerless to stop it, said Hilary. However, the active member of the British Earth and Aerial Mystery Society, or BEAMS for short, believes the tide is turning as people increasingly come forward with their own tales of alien abduction. Later this month, she will be among a host of speakers at the Anomalous Mind explain how we got there. Also unexplained was how the petrol level in the car hadn't gone down, she said. When we got home, I got changed and found triangular suction marks on my stomach. Blood suction marks. I thought, flippin' hell, look at that. The marks themselves quickly disappeared, and it wasn't until 7 years later that Hilary had a dream of travelling in what appeared to be a hexagonal spaceship. Within a short space of time, she started suffering flashback memories, which, she believes, began to reveal what really happened in Wales. Today, after years of studying experience phenomena, she has come to the conclusion she was teleported by aliens from another dimension. They transport you molecularly and can create portals in a wall or closed door, she said. In the flashbacks, I was on a beach and could see this alien being who was about 6 feet tall and wearing green coveralls. I couldn't see his face, but he could communicate mind to mind and had a box around his neck for seismic testing and warned me that he was going to cause an earthquake. When he did, they were forced to run, she said, and she got into a small round vehicle which took her and the alien onto a small oval UFA. I thought, flippin' heck, she said. She later created a drawing of the flight deck of the UFO, which shows a console and an alien moving a series of levers, which she describes as looking like those in an old-fashioned railway signal box. Clearly a cover memory, she said. She believes the relatively pleasant events she recalled had been created by the aliens to hide the real nature of the traumatic experience she actually underwent. On the second occasion, she said she woke at a friend's house to find she had an unexplained black eye. Hillary revealed that her research has led her to the conclusion that aliens target certain human tribes whose genetic makeup is of more interest. The Celtic tribes from Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall and Brittany are definitely on the list, she said. They are trying to make alien-human hybrids, and it seems the genetic material of these races are more compatible. And following on with the alien UFO type theme, something from the gizmodo.com.au website. Why mysterious UFO-like lights glow in this Norwegian Valley? And it's written by Sarah Zhang. As a name, Hessdalen may be more familiar to UFO watchers than scientists. The valley in Norway is prone to strange, hovering, flashing balls of lights, best attributed, as some believe, to alien origins. Now, scientists say they are on the verge of an explanation. The valley is a giant natural battery. But first, let's set the scene, as Carolyn Williams does wonderfully in her piece about the Hessdalen phenomena for New Scientist. On a cold, dark Norwegian night, about a dozen times a year, you might see this. Sometimes the lights are as big as cars and can float around for up to 2 hours. Other times they zip down the valley before suddenly fading away. Then there are the blue and white flashes that come and go in the blink of an eye, and daytime sightings that look like metallic objects in the sky. The Hessdalen phenomenon has been around for at least a century, but it reached a peak in the 1980s when the lights suddenly started appearing 10 or 20 times a week. UFO enthusiasts took this as a sign that the valley was a portal to other worlds. Google Hessdalen today and you'll still find plenty of UFO conspiracy sites. But those strange bursts of light in the 1980s attracted physicists too, interest piqued by the idea of some unexplained natural phenomenon. In the decades since, they have determined the glow likely comes from air turned into plasma. The unique geology of the valley could be responsible for this plasma. The valley is formed by rocks on one side rich in copper and on the other rich in iron and zinc, not unlike the cathode and anode of a battery. Sulfuric acid leached from the abandoned sulphur mine at the bottom of the valley could then turn the river into the weak acid of an electrolyte. But where does the charge to energize plasma come from? It may be extraterrestrial after all. The Hessdalen phenomenon seems especially common after a display of northern lights, reports Williams, when solar wind ionizes the Earth's atmosphere. The science is certainly not yet definitive, but the details so far are intriguing. For me, the idea of a valley battery created by natural geology and charged by solar winds coming from 90 million miles away feels like a far more astonishing explanation than aliens. And if you visit the show notes at the www.origins.info website and their names and ages: Morris 14, Martha 12, Lewis 9, Jenny 8 and Betty 5, stencilled beneath, along with speculation about what happened to them. Fayetteville was and is a small town, with a main street that doesn't run longer than 100 yards, and rumours always played a larger role in the case than evidence. No one even agreed on whether the children were dead or alive. From the www.smithsonianmag.com website, an article by Karen Abbott. The Children Who Went Up in Smoke. What everyone knew for certain was this. On the night before Christmas 1945, George and Jenny Sodder and 9 of their 10 children went to sleep. One son was away in the army. Around 1 a.m. a fire broke out. George and Jenny and 4 of their children escaped. But the other 5 were never seen again. George had tried to save them, breaking a window to re-enter the house, slicing a swath of skin from his arm. He could see nothing through the smoke and fire, which had swept through all of the downstairs rooms, living and dining room, kitchen, office, and his and Jenny's bedroom. He took frantic stock of what he knew. 2-year-old Sylvia, whose crib was in their bedroom, was safe outside, as was 17-year-old Marion and 2 sons, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., who had fled the upstairs bedroom they shared, singeing their hair on the way out. He figured Morris, Martha, Lewis, Jenny and Betty still had to be up there, cowering in 2 bedrooms on either end of the hallway, separated by a staircase that was now engulfed in the flames. He raced back outside, hoping to reach them through the upstairs window, but the ladder he always kept propped against the house was strangely missing. An idea struck. He would drive one of his 2 coal trucks up to the house and climb atop of it to reach the windows. But even though they'd functioned perfectly the day before, neither would start now. He ransacked his mind for another option. He tried to scoop water from a rain barrel, but found it frozen solid. 5 of his children were stuck somewhere inside those great whipping ropes of smoke. He didn't notice that his arm was slick with blood, that his voice hurt from screaming their names. His daughter Marion sprinted to a neighbour's home to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, but couldn't get any operator response. A neighbour who saw the blaze made a call from a nearby tavern, but again no operator responded. Exasperated, the neighbour drove into town and tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who initiated Fayetteville's version of a fire alarm, a phone tree system whereby one firefighter phoned another who phoned another. The fire department was only 2.5 miles away, but the crew didn't arrive until 8 a.m, by which point the Sodders' home had been reduced to a smoking pile of ash. George and Jenny assumed that 5 of their children were dead, but a brief search of the grounds on Christmas Day turned up no trace of remains. Chief Morris suggested that the blaze had been hot enough to completely cremate the bodies. A state police inspector combed the rubble and attributed the fire to faulty wiring. George covered the basement with 5 feet of dirt, intending to preserve the site as a memorial. The coroner's office issued 5 death certificates just before the new year, attributing the causes to fire or suffocation. But the Sodders had begun to wonder if their children were still alive. George Sodder was born in Giorgio Sodder in Tula, Sardinia in 1895 and immigrated to the United States in 1908 when he was 13. An older brother who had accompanied him to Ellis Island immediately returned to Italy, leaving George on his own. He found work on the Pennsylvania railroads, carrying water and supplies to the labourers, and after a few years moved to Smithers, West Virginia. Smart and ambitious, he first worked as a driver and then launched his own trucking company, hauling dirt for construction and later freight and coal. One day he walked into a local store called a Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani, who had come over from Italy when she was 3. They married and had 10 children between 1923 and 1943 and settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, an Appalachian town with a small but active Italian immigrant community. The Sodders were, said one county magistrate, one of the most respected middle-class families around. George held strong opinions about everything from business to current events and politics, but was, for some reason, reticent to talk about his youth. He never explained what had happened back in Italy to make him want to leave. The Sodders planted flowers across the space where their house had stood and began to stitch together a series of odd moments leading up to the fire. There was a stranger who appeared at the home a few months earlier, back in the fall, asking about hauling work. He meandered to the back of the house, pointed to 2 separate fuse boxes and said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." Strange, George thought, especially since he had just had the wiring checked by the local power company, which pronounced it in fine condition. Around the same time, another man tried to sell the family life insurance and became irate when George declined. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke," he warned, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was indeed outspoken about his dislike for the Italian dictator, occasionally engaging in heated arguments with other members of Fayetteville's Italian community, and at the time didn't take the man's threats seriously. The older Sodder sons also recalled something peculiar. Just before Christmas, they noticed a man parked along US Highway 21, intently watching the younger kids as they came home from school. Around 12:30 Christmas morning, after the children had opened a few presents and everyone had gone to sleep, the shrill ring of the telephone broke the quiet. Jenny rushed to answer it. An unfamiliar female voice asked for an unfamiliar name. There was raucous laughter and glasses clinking in the background. Jenny said, "You have the wrong number," and hung up. Tiptoeing back to bed, she noticed that all of the downstairs lights were still on and the curtains open. The front door was unlocked. She saw Marion asleep on the sofa in the living room and assumed that the other kids were upstairs in bed. She turned out the lights, closed the curtains, locked the door, and returned to her room. She had just begun to doze when she heard one sharp, loud bang on the roof, and then a rolling noise. An hour later, she was roused again, this time by heavy smoke curling into her room. Jenny couldn't understand how 5 children could perish in a fire and leave no bones, no flesh, nothing. She conducted a private experiment, burning animal bones, chicken bones, beef joints, pork chop bones, to see if the fire consumed them. Each time she was left with a heap of charred bones. She knew that remnants of various household appliances had been found in the burned-out basement, still identifiable. An employee at a crematorium informed her that bones remain after bodies are burned for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees. Their house was destroyed in 45 minutes. The collection of odd moments grew. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that their lines appeared to have been cut, not burned. They realised that if the fire had been electrical, the result of faulty wiring, as the official report stated, then the power would have been dead. So how to explain the lighted downstairs rooms? A witness came forward claiming he saw a man at the fire scene taking a block and tackle used for renovating car engines. Could he be the reason George's trucks refused to start? One day, while the family was visiting the site, Sylvia found a hard rubber object in the yard. Jenny recalled hearing the hard thud on the roof, the rolling sound. George concluded it was a napalm, pineapple bomb of the type used in warfare. Then came the reports of sightings. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children peering from a passing car while the fire was in progress. A woman operating a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, some 50 miles west, said she saw the children the morning after the fire. "I served them breakfast," she told police. There was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court too. A woman at a Charleston hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and said she had seen 4 of the 5 a week after the fire. The children were accompanied by 2 men and women, all of Italian extraction, she said in a statement. I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. In 1947, George and Jenny sent a letter about the case to the FBI and received a reply from J. Edgar Hoover. Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau. Hoover's agents said they would assist if they could get permission from the local authorities, but the Fayetteville Police and Fire Departments declined the offer. Next, the Sodders turned to a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley, who discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was a member of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire accidental. He also heard a curious story from a Fayetteville minister about F.J. Morris, the fire chief. Although Morris had claimed no remains were found, he supposedly confided that he'd discovered a heart in the ashes. He hid it inside a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. Tinsley persuaded Morris to show them the spot. Together they dug up the box and took it straight to a local funeral director, who poked and prodded the heart and concluded it was beef liver, untouched by the fire. Soon afterward, the Sodders heard rumours that the fire chief had told others that the contents of the box had not been found in the fire at all, that he had buried the beef liver in the rubble in the hope that finding any remains would placate the family enough to stop the investigation. Over the next few years, the tips and leads continued to come. George saw a newspaper photo of school children in New York City and was convinced that one of them was his daughter Betty. He drove to Manhattan in search of the child, but her parents refused to speak to him. In August 1949, the Sodders decided to mount a new search at the fire scene and brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. The excavation was thorough, uncovering several small objects, damaged coins, a partly burned dictionary, and several shards of vertebrae. Hunter sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution, which issued the following report. The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy of 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17 maturation. The vertebrae showed no evidence that they had been exposed to fire, the report said, and it is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful excavation of the basement of the house. Noting that the house reportedly burned for only about half an hour or so, it said that one would expect to find the full skeletons of the 5 children, rather than only 4 vertebrae. The bones, the report concluded, were most likely in the supply of dirt George used to fill in the basement to create the memorial for his children. The Smithsonian report prompted 2 hearings at the Capitol in Charleston, after which Governor Okiel Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders their search was hopeless and declared the case closed. Undeterred, George and Jenny erected the billboard along Route 16 and passed out flyers offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of their children. They soon increased the amount to $10,000. A letter arrived from a woman in St. Louis saying the oldest girl, Martha, was in a convent there. Another tip came from Texas, where a patron in a bar overheard an incriminating conversation about a long-ago Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. Someone in Florida claimed the children were staying with a distant relative of Jenny's. George travelled the country to investigate each lead, always returning home without any answers. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny went to get the mail and found an envelope addressed only to her. It was postmarked in Kentucky, but had no return address. Inside was a photo of a man in his mid-20s. On its flip side, a cryptic handwritten note read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, A90132 or 35. She and George couldn't deny the resemblance to their Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire. Beyond the obvious similarities, dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, they had the same straight, strong nose and the same upward tilt of the left eyebrow. Once again they hired a private detective and sent him to Kentucky. They never heard from him again. The Sodders feared that if they published the letter or the name of the town on the postmark, they might harm their son. Instead, they amended the billboard to include the updated image of Louis and hung an enlarged version over the fireplace. "Time is running out for us," George said in an interview, "but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." He died a year later, in 1968, still hoping for a break in the case. Jenny erected a fence around her property and began adding rooms to her home, building layer after layer between her and the outside. Since the fire, she had worn black exclusively as a sign of mourning and continued to do so until her own death in 1989. The billboard finally came down. Her children and grandchildren continued the investigation and came up with theories of their own. The local mafia had tried to recruit him and he declined. They tried to extort money from him and he refused. The children were kidnapped by someone they knew, someone who burst into the unlocked front door, told them about the fire and offered to take them someplace safe. They might not have survived the night. If they had, and if they lived for decades, if it really was Louis in that photograph, they failed to contact their parents only because they wanted to protect them. The youngest and last surviving Sodder child, Sylvia, who is now 69, doesn't believe her siblings perished in the fire. When time permits, she visits crime-sleuthing websites and engages with people still interested in their family's mystery. Her very first memories are of that night in 1945 when she was 2 years old. She will never forget the sight of her father bleeding or the terrible symphony of everyone's screams, and she is no closer now to understanding why. It's hard to imagine a fragile spider killing and eating a full-grown bat. I mean, there's no way a tiny spider could have any sort of muscle power over a fully grown bat, right? Believe it or not, there are 8-legged bugs out there that can pounce on bats and eventually devour them. And when they can't, they rely on their superior web-spinning skills to get the job done. From the www.odditycentral.com website, an article by Sumitra. This collection of bat-eating spiders is probably the scariest thing you'll see today. And of course, with this website, it's worth a visit to the show notes to have a look at the photographs of these spiders with bats in their webs. Quite horrific, really. Quite worth a look. One of the earliest sightings of bat-eating spiders occurred way back in 1941, when Indian scientist G.C. Bhattacharya of the Bose Research Institute walked into a cowshed in a village near the city of Calcutta. In a letter to an unknown publication, he wrote a detailed account of his experience. Entering into the cowshed, I noticed a pipistrelle bat struggling to drag itself out of a crevice between two bamboo strips of a wall, and a big house spider was seen firmly gripping the former by the neck with its powerful mandibles. No matter how much the little bat kicked and screamed and flailed, the spider held on with a death grip. There was an intermittent gasping and screaming of the bat, Bhattacharya wrote. Eventually he focused a torch on the spot, and as soon as the light fell on the pair, the bat screamed loudly and managed to drag itself through a certain distance on the matted shed wall. About 20 minutes later, the bat, thoroughly exhausted, stretched out its wing and gave in. Bhattacharya then captured both victim and predator in a glass jar and took them home for closer observation. The next morning he found the spider resting peacefully at the top of the jar, while the bat lay dead at the bottom, untouched. It had visible injuries to its neck and had died sometime during the night. Martin Neifele from the University of Basel, Switzerland, and Mirjam Kornschild from the University of Ulm in Germany recently conducted a study to find out just how often the spiders preyed on bats. They went through several published research papers, blog posts and Flickr images. They also interviewed scientists who studied the subject and veterinarians who worked at bat hospitals. Through their research, they discovered 52 individual reports of bats caught by spiders, both in actively hunted as well as trapped in webs. 29 of these stories had never been published before. They uncovered reports from every continent except Antarctica, but found that most of the reports came from tropical regions. Today it is well known that 90% of these spiders reside in warmer regions, around the equator, between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. About 40% inhabit South America and tropical regions of Northern America. 30% live in Asia, and the remaining are found in Australia and Papua New Guinea. In most of the incidents recorded by Martin and Mirjam, the spiders were quite large, 10 to 15 centimetre leg span and 1 to 7 grams in weight. A majority of the spiders were nocturnal web builders, spinning webs up to 1.5 metres across. Occasionally groups of spiders got together to build several interconnected webs. Most of these webs were found near buildings inhabited by bat colonies. Only 12% of the spiders were able to catch bats without the aid of webs. Tarantulas in particular were found eating small bats in the tropical rainforests of Peru, Ecuador and Brazil. The victim bats were quite small in comparison, 10 to 24 centimetre wingspan and 3 to 8 grams in weight. A majority of these bats were small or juvenile insect eaters. Once caught, they usually died of exhaustion while trying to free themselves, or dehydration, or starvation, or even overheating. Sometimes the spiders attacked the bats, killing them during the struggle. There are also cases of spiders eating bats that they found dead. 52 reports of bat killings in about 100 years doesn't sound like a lot. In fact, Martin and Mirjam were quite surprised at the low number, considering the sheer number of spiderwebs out there in the wild. So they concluded that bats might actually be smarter than we think, avoiding the spiderwebs with the help of echolocation. Individual silk threads might be hard to echolocate, but the dense decorations and barriers that spiders place on their webs, and the spiders sitting in the web centre, are large enough for bats to detect in flight and avoid. So while spiders have the ability to kill bats, The bats can easily detect and avoid spiders. In the end, I suppose nature does balance everything out. And like I said in the beginning of this article, visit the show notes, have a look at the photographs there. Quite interesting. Ambroise Paré was a medieval doctor who served as a battlefield surgeon for Kings Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, and made great advances in pathology and surgical techniques. He's the one who convinced people to stop pouring boiling oil in open wounds. In addition to his many advances, he also had a lot of ideas about how monsters and monstrosities were created. Besides God's will and evil, here are 12 ways Paré believed that monsters like man-goats and brain scorpions were created, from his book on monsters and marvels. Number 1. Menstrual blood. If your baby is born with the head of a parrot, you probably only have yourself and your menstrual blood to blame. Paré warned that women sullied by menstrual blood will conceive monsters. Also, if your kid is sick a lot, it's probably because your baby touched your dirty period. Paré wrote, "Women who will have conceived during her period will engender those inclined to leprosy, scurvy, gout, scrofula, and more." Number 2. Prophetic Warnings. If you see a horse with the face of a man, put down your iPhone. God is warning you of some great misfortune. Paré wrote that God often sends monsters as a signal of his displeasure. When Pope Julius II waged war against King Louis XII, for example, God sent a winged monster with both male and female bits to end the fighting, according to Paré. Number 3. Too much sperm. Bad news, men. Paré thought that men with too much seed could produce a baby with 2 heads, 4 eyes, 2 chests, and 4 hands or horns. He used a woman who gave birth to a child with horns as an example. Number 4. Imaginative faculty. Paré wrote about a woman with 2 heads who went begging from door to door, but was cast out of the country where she lived because doctors believed that if a pregnant woman saw her, she might influence their imaginations and cause them to give birth to monsters. Number 5. Crossing your legs. Paré believed that if your womb was too narrow, you could birth a misshapen child. He also argued that women who crossed their legs or bound their stomachs too tightly could give birth to monstrous putrefied babies. Number 6. According to Paré, women who didn't eat the right food could potentially give birth to monsters. He noted that this happened to the women of Naples frequently, because they preferred to eat fruit and grasses, and other bad-tasting and unnutritious things, which generate such animals through putrefaction, than to eat good nourishing food just in order to be sparing and elegant and thin. Number 7. Sniffing basil. Paré wrote of an Italian who died of an extreme headache. When the man's head was opened after his death, the doctors found a scorpion inside his brain, which was attributed to the man's habit of sniffing basil. Number 8. Throwing a mouse between your teats. According to Paré, some have attributed monsters to being procreated from the corruption of foul and filthy foods that women eat or want to eat, or that they abhor looking upon just after they conceived, or, they say, that someone may have tossed something between their teats, such as a cherry, plum, frog, mouse, or other thing that can render infants monstrous. What other things, Pari? Number 9. Showing a pregnant woman food. Modern doctors place a lot of dietary restrictions on pregnant women. No sushi, no lunch meat. Watch the mercury. But none of those restrictions could hold a candle to Pari, who wrote that women could give birth to a baby that looked like a piece of bacon if that woman was shown the food and not immediately allowed to eat it. Number 10. Being a sodomist and an atheist. Generally, medieval doctors believed that if a half-human, half-animal was born, it was wrought of some serious human and animal sin. Pari described half men, half swine, and a dog with the head of a bird to describe such unholy couplings. He then went on to say that such sin causes so many monstrosities that he couldn't and wouldn't describe them all. For, he wrote, what can sodomists and atheists expect, who couple against God and nature with brute animals? Number 11. Constellations. According to Pari, a farmer who had a cow with a human head was pardoned for his alleged crime against cows because an astrologer did some calculations and discovered that the monster was born of a constellation and not sin. At least, not this time. And number 12, the devil. Obviously. If your monster hasn't been created by an excess of basil or cinching your belt too tight around your pregnant belly, it was probably made by a demon. Pari wrote that the devil and his demons take the form of centaurs, snakes, and other monsters who howl at night and make noise as if they were in chains. They move benches, tables, trestles, rock the children, play chess on the chessboard, turn the pages of books, count money, and one hears them walking about in the chamber. They open doors and windows and cast dishes to the ground, break pots and glasses, and make other racket. What is time? We can measure it and slice it up into millennia or nanoseconds, and we can sense our experience through it. The Encarta Encyclopedia can define it as conscious experience of duration, the period during which an action or event occurs. And we can even abstractly label it the fourth dimension. But all that really doesn't bring us any closer to a true understanding of what time is, or how it works. What we do have are some very peculiar stories of rare instances in which time doesn't seem to flow in the way we normally experience it. People report gaps in time, jumps through time, missing time, or perhaps even glimpses into past or future events. Because our perception of time is usually so routine and mundane that when a person is enveloped by one of these time slips, they report it as the most bizarre and disorienting thing they've ever experienced. Here are some of those stories. From the paranormal.about.com website. Bizarre slips in time. True stories that challenge our concept of time and reality, by Stephen Wagner. A blip in reality. In 1991, Glenn was a university student in Nova Scotia. What began as an ordinary bus trip back to his hometown to visit his parents turned into a confusing distortion of time and space. I sat at the back of the bus and there was nobody around me, says Glenn. But there was a family sitting behind the driver in the front. The bus ride was uneventful until we came close to my parents' hometown. I was looking out the window and looked at the Michelin tyre factory as we went by it going uphill. When the bus reached the top of the hill, I got a strange feeling. And for some unknown reason, I started to imagine many people on the bus laughing at me. Right then, there was a blip in reality, and the bus was suddenly about a mile back on the highway. I then had the experience of watching the bus drive past the tyre factory again. This kind of scared me, and I noticed that the family sitting in the front, who were talking loudly before, were now dead quiet. I approached the bus driver when we stopped and told him what I thought happened. He looked really nervous, and he said something like, "Things like that happen." A brief leap in time. The bus driver was right, apparently. Things like that do happen. Just ask Sue, who in the autumn of 1994 was driving with her boyfriend Jim to their home in Fallbrook, California, when they might have narrowly escaped a larger rift in time. There are 2 roads into Fallbrook, says Sue, from the north and from the south. We approached the south, heading north on Mission Road, which is a 4-mile, curvy 2-lane road. It was a Friday evening, and I blurted out how weird it was that we hadn't passed any cars in the opposite direction since our turn onto Mission Road. Fallbrook is a small town, but this was a very well-travelled road. I knew it was 6:24 because I had just looked at the big amber display on the stereo, when all of a sudden the car died. The pedal went hard and the lights went off. I remember feeling confused, thinking that we ran out of gas, yet knowing that we had plenty of fuel. We coasted off to a dirt turnout immediately ahead. Jim asked what happened, and I had no answer. But I felt like I had just dozed off, or had gone through jello, or I don't know what. I put it in gear. Jim jumped out, came around to my side and opened the door. I jumped into the passenger seat, he got in, cranked it over and vroom, off we went. As we pulled away, I felt irritated, a little nervous. But sure, something really weird had just happened. Then I glanced at the clock on the stereo again. It was 6:36 p.m. 12 minutes had passed when, being generous, the whole incident couldn't have taken more than 1.5 minutes, max. He got there before he arrived. We are used to time progressing in a linear fashion, one event leading to another. Strangely, it doesn't always work like that. Consider the experience of Eula White in rural Alabama when she was a young girl in the 1920s. In those days, Eula says, rural Alabama was still kind of backward. Little electricity and horses and wagons the only transportation for many farm folk. I remember it was a bright summer day. Early that morning, the other woman and I had gathered on the front porch of the Hawkins farmhouse to shell quite a few bushels of peas and beans. About mid-afternoon, we were still on the porch shelling peas. We looked up and saw Mr. Hawkins approaching the house. Thrown across the saddle in front of him was a large white cloth sack of flour, and cradled in his left arm was a brown bag of other groceries. We watched as he rode up to the gate, and he stopped there, waiting for someone to open it. One of the boys ran to the gate and opened it. Then, in full view of all of us women and children, Mr. Hawkins vanished. He just disappeared, instantly. We sat there for a second or so, just astonished. Then, terrified, we began screaming. After a few minutes we calmed down, but we were still shaking and confused. We just didn't know what to do. So after a while we went back to shelling peas. Mrs. Hawkins made one of the boys close the gate. About half an hour later, we looked up and again saw Mr. Hawkins riding towards the house with that same white sack of flour across the saddle in front of him and that same brown bag of groceries in his left hand. Again he rode up to the gate without a sound and stopped. None of us had the nerve to open the gate. We were all just too afraid to move. We just sat there staring at him, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, to our relief, Mr. Hawkins spoke. "Well, is someone going to open the gate for me?" Mr. Hawkins got there before he arrived. Instant replay. A similar replay of time happened to Ryan Bratton at the age of 8. It was an otherwise ordinary day for him and his friend as they were sitting in the yard while other kids rode their bikes up and down a driveway. A car came down the road and stopped at a house, Ryan remembers. Kid got out and ran inside, making noises that kids around his age make. Then a girl rode her bike down the driveway. A couple of minutes after this happened, the same car went down the road, stopped at the house, and the same kid got out of the car and ran inside screaming the exact things he had been saying. Then the girl went down the hill on her bike again. I looked over to my friend and he said he had no idea what just happened. Journey to the past. The most amazing experiences or slips in time, perhaps, are those in which people actually see, hear, and even interact with other people and things that seem to have been in another space and time. John was a 6-year-old in Stoke-on-Trent, England, when his brush with the past occurred. He was on his way to school with his friend when they stopped to watch some builders working on some new houses. As they approached the site, they noticed an old cottage nearby. An old lady came out and offered John and his friends some lemonade, and they went into her house. After leaving the cottage, they continued on to school, only to discover that it was 4 o'clock and school was just closing. They had left home at 1:30 p.m. on a journey that should have taken 20 minutes. The next day, John and his friend took the same route to school, but to their amazement, there was no sign of any cottage or the old lady they had seen the previous day. The only explanation seems to be that John and his friend experienced some sort of time slip, in which for a few hours they were transported back to an earlier time when indeed a cottage and its occupant did exist on that land. And to a future city. As strange as it was, it may be easier to understand John's experience with something that has already taken place than it is to comprehend Daisy's encounter with a place that doesn't yet exist and may not for centuries. Daisy and her friend Rick were driving to another friend's house in September of 2004 in Rick's beat-up old truck. Suddenly the truck's engine died and Rick and I were stranded on a deserted highway in the middle of the night, Daisy says. We were surrounded on both sides of the road by cornfields that stretched into the distance. Rick began a desperate effort to restart the truck, but nothing seemed to work. We decided to walk to the nearest town, about 2 miles away, to find a payphone to call our friend. We walked for what seemed like hours, and the town was nowhere in sight. However, just when desperation was about to grip us, we saw a light, a gloriously bright light, shining over the steep hill ahead of us. We ran up the hill that blocked us from the light and were flabbergasted by what we saw. Just over the hill, Rick and I saw what could only be described as a futuristic city, with lights streaming out of every window of the massive metallic towers. In the middle of the futuristic city was a huge silver dome. I stared at the city, stunned, until Rick elbowed me, which pulled me out of my trance, and he pointed to the sky. Hovering above the city were hundreds of hovercraft. One flew towards us with amazing speed. Rick and I were so scared that we took off running back to the broken-down truck. I never looked back, but I felt someone watching me the whole way. When we got back to the truck, it started without difficulty. Rick and I took off as fast as we could in the opposite direction. We never went back or spoke of it again to this day. music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website at www.origins.info. We have a Facebook page if you'd like to visit that, www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or click on the Facebook link at the show notes. There's been no donations to the podcast since the time of the last recording of the Mysteries Abound podcast, so I'm just going to say a big thank you to all those people who have donated in the past. Your help is greatly appreciated. Anyway, let's move on to the next article from the www.theepochtimes.com. Out of place in time. Was this hammer made 100 million years ago? And this is written by Tara McIsaac. A hammer was found in London, Texas, in 1934, encased in stone that had formed around it. The rock surrounding the hammer is said to be more than 100 million years old, suggesting the hammer was made well before humans who could have made such an object are thought to have existed. Much mystery surrounds the so-called London hammer. Many have contested claims that the hammer is so old. Carl Bohr, who was in possession of the artefact, announced that it was tested by Battelle Laboratory in Columbus, Ohio, a lab that has tested moon rocks for NASA. According to Bohr, the tests found the hammer to have unusual metallurgy: 96.6% iron, 2.6% chlorine, 0.74% sulfur, and no carbon. Carbon is usually what strengthens brittle iron, so it is strange that carbon is absent. Chlorine is not usually found in iron. The iron shows a high degree of craftsmanship without bubbles in the metal. Furthermore, it is said to be coated in an iron oxide that would not readily form under natural conditions and which prevents rust. Glenn J. Kubin, a vocal skeptic of Bohr's hammer claims, wrote in a 1997 paper titled "The London Hammer, an Alleged Out-of-Place Artifact," that the tests were conducted privately rather than at Battelle Laboratory. He cites a 1985 issue of the magazine Creation ex Nihilo. Epoch Times contacted Battelle Laboratory to verify. A spokeswoman said she had not heard of the hammer in her 15 years at the lab, but she would check into it. Kubin said the stone may contain materials that are more than 100 million years old, but that doesn't mean the rock formed around the hammer so long ago. Some limestone has formed around artefacts known to be from the 20th century, so concretions can form fairly quickly around objects. Concretions are masses of hardened mineral matter. Bohr's website says, however, that the fossils in the stone surrounding the hammer retain fine detail, indicating that they were not reworked but are part of the original formation. This would suggest the fossils and the hammer are from the same time period, that the fossils did not just get mixed up in materials that formed rock around the hammer at a later date. Even if Bohr's statements were true about the fossils retaining fine detail, it would not at all preclude the nodule being a relatively recent concretion, since the reworking would not require any significant amount of vibration or transport, wrote Kubin in an email. Kubin also questioned Bohr's claims, since they had not been published in a peer-reviewed journal or other authoritative literature. Carbon dating performed in the late 1990s showed inconclusive dates ranging from the present to 700 years ago, Bohr supporter David Lyons reported at the time. According to Kubin, Lyons said the test had been contaminated by more recent organic substances. Such contamination is one of the reasons Bohr is said to have delayed having the artefact carbon dated. Skeptics say he delayed because he feared being proven wrong. Dating is often called into question on both sides by skeptics and proponents for various reasons when it comes to these artefacts. The object was found by a hiker, and it seems it was not found embedded in the original layer of rock, which would have made a stronger case for an ancient origin. It was a chunk of rock found resting on a ledge, perhaps having tumbled there from within a larger formation. As evidence of the hammer's age, Bohr said part of the wooden handle had turned to coal. The photos of the hammer show a black part of the hammer that looks like it could be coal. The debate surrounding the hammer's origin has become bound up with the creationism versus evolutionism debate. Bohr is a creationist. Kuban is a creationist turned skeptic, or a much more moderate creationist. Creationists take various stances on this artefact, and many evolutionists dismiss it as a creationist hoax. Kuban wrote in an email that not a single major creationist group has endorsed his claims about the hammer. The object remains a fascinating one apart from its role in this controversy. This is one of many objects said to be out of place in time. Well, everyone, that just about concludes the Mysteries Abound podcast, episode 91. Hope you enjoyed today's show. And just before I go, I suppose I could squeeze in a short creepypasta story for those of you who will have withdrawals if I don't do it. Only a short one, though. From the www.creepypasta.com, Slender Man. After waking up with a jolt, the girl laid in bed for a few seconds longer. Reaching over to switch on her bedside lamp, she tried to remember exactly what had stolen her sweet slumber away. When she couldn't, the brunette swung her legs over the side of the bed and heaved herself up. Checking the time on her phone, she snorted when she saw it was midnight, the witching hour. Knowing that sleep would only evade her, she left her bedroom for the kitchen, a good cup of coffee on her mind. As she passed by her front door, a chill spread like liquid fire down her spine. It's only winter, she told herself, focusing again on the coffee plan. Measuring out scoops, water, and preparing her cup kept her occupied. But as the dark liquid boiled, she had nothing left to keep her mind from wandering off. The chill returned and she couldn't help but glance behind her to the front door. It stood there innocently enough, just like always. The deadbolt was still in place and she could see nothing amiss with it. Turning back to her coffee, she did her best to forget about the feeling. With her cup in hand, she started back towards her bedroom. As she walked by the front door, she decided that a quick glance out of the peephole would help calm her restless mind. The chill worsened with each step she took towards the door and further away from the safety and warmth of her blankets. She pressed her empty hand against the cold metal door and took a deep breath before leading her eye to the peephole. At first she could only see an inky blackness, and somehow it seemed to swirl in itself. When she blinked in surprise, the void melted away. She wished it hadn't. In its place there stood what she could only guess was once a man. The limbs were long and inhumanly awkward, with bulky joints branching off into several arms, not unlike the branches of a tree. The creature was draped in a black suit, somehow making the thing more nightmarish to her. The icing on the proverbial cake, however, was what passed as the hellish thing's face. It was as though her mind had blurred the ghastly visage to spare itself further shock and horror. She shoved herself away from the door, with the hand still pressed against it. The scalding mug of coffee fell, the liquid burning her bare legs as she fell backwards and tried to crawl away from the door. She knew somehow that her mind hadn't been playing tricks on her. As she Crab walked away from the door, she watched as tendrils as black as the void she first saw snake around through the cracks. The girl was trapped between the instinct to flee and the gut feeling to not turn her back on the door. When the door jolted, the urge to flee overcame her, and she slipped in the burning liquid as she tried to make it back to her room. She knew deep down that she was trapping herself in a corner, but she had to get away from the door. The girl was halfway down the hallway when she heard the previously locked door creak open. She screamed and slipped into a wall, cracking her chin on it and stunning her. After that, there was only blackness. "Nicole?" A warm male voice snapped the woman out of her trance. As she turned around, she was met by one of her sister's doctors. She nodded, not sure if she should say anything, or even if she could find her voice if she did have something to say. That morning she had gotten an urgent phone call from the hospital saying that her sister, Lindsay, was there. Before they had even left to see her, the doctors had pulled her off to one side and insisted that they talk to her about what might have happened. Phrases like self-inflicted and assault had been thrown around, and Nicole felt her mind reel. She still hadn't fully understood what they had been saying until she saw Lindsay with her own eyes. Her little sister had a bandage wrapped round her head, covering both of her ears as well as her eyes. They said it was to keep her now deadened eyes from drying out, and to try to keep infection out of the wounds Lindsay had made to her ears. The doctors had guessed that either she or someone else had jammed a pencil in them to keep her off balance, or to deafen her against something. There was the mix of first and second-degree burns on her hands, legs and feet from what was assumed to be the coffee her neighbours found slipped all over the entire entry to her apartment. As Nicole walked into her sister's hospital room the first time, she thought she spied the silhouette of a man in the window. That, she knew, was impossible. Her sister's room was on the 3rd story of the hospital.